Hey, hello friends, it's Pastor Scott coming to you with our life group study looking at Jesus School of Discipleship. In the season of Lent leading up to Easter, we walked through John's Gospel looking at the journey to the cross. And we were focused on the miracles that Jesus did that demonstrated that He's more powerful than other pagan gods. We also looked at the 7 statements that Jesus said, I am actually the embodiment of God made flesh, present and among us. Well, we're going to go back and unpack a little deeper, specifically Jesus' teaching to the disciples. Can you imagine having the opportunity to actually attend a school of discipleship with Jesus Himself? Well, we actually have that. In John's Gospel, John records for us 5 chapters where at the Last Supper, Jesus gives a very specific teaching to His followers about how they are to be His disciples, how they are to bring the message to the world that Jesus has given to them. So in the way that Jesus has given His message to His followers, now He says, all right guys, now you're going to go out and share it. So at that Last Supper, this is where Jesus unpacks His mission as well as the mission of the disciples. So we're going to spend the next 5 weeks between now and the end of the school year looking more deeply at each one of those 5 chapters. In all of the New Testament, this is the longest section of Jesus' teaching, even longer than the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, that covers 3 chapters. This is 5 chapters of Jesus teaching directly to the disciples. So here we go. We're going to jump into Jesus' School of Discipleship because John records these things not only for the followers of Jesus at that time, but also for everyone who believes based on the message that they came to bring. That's you and I. If you trace it all the way back, we have come to know the gospel because someone shared it with us. Someone shared it with them, and it goes all the way back to the 12 disciples of Jesus and to His immediate followers at Pentecost. So that's what we're going to lean into in these next weeks. We're going to ask the questions of what does it mean to follow Jesus in a world that has often rejected the things of God. So here we go. In John chapter 12, Jesus continues to share with His disciples that He wants them to walk in the light, not in the darkness. We're going to see those themes of light and darkness that are coming out. And the desire is that it doesn't just mean physical light and dark, but spiritual light and dark. We want to be in the light as Jesus is in the light. We want to have knowledge and understanding. We want it to sink deeply into our soul, that we know who Christ is and what He has called us to do. The interesting thing is in John 12, at the very end of that chapter, He reminds the disciples that He has not come to judge the world. There were many that thought that that's what the Messiah would do. He would come with God's judgment. But rather, Jesus reminds them, I have come to save the world. Now we know that in Revelation, which John also writes, there will be a day where the enemies of God will be judged. But Jesus' first coming, His first time where He arrives to bring that message, it's a message of salvation. And now He's handed that on to us. So that's what we're going to lean into. At the very beginning of John chapter 13, this is where Jesus is gathering with His disciples for that Passover meal. They're going to eat the Last Supper, a Passover, just before Jesus goes to the cross. So at that Passover, He begins to selectively look at the elements of the Passover meal. Some of you had the opportunity to celebrate Passover with me this year, where we gathered in the youth center there and walked through the elements of Passover. So Jesus very specifically chose this meal, this festival, which is important. We're going to unpack that because the whole idea of Passover is the night of our freedom. So in that message about freedom and the exodus from Egypt, Jesus begins to give new meaning for His disciples. The first thing that He does is John chapter 13 tells us that Jesus loved His disciples even all the way to the end. Now, the word there is telos, which means not only did He love them all the way to the end of His life, but He loved them completely and fully, all the way to the fullest extent of love. So Jesus is showing this love to the disciples. And the word there, completely, is the same root word, telos, that when Jesus says at the cross, it is finished, which Pastor Ryan shared with us on Good Friday, tetelestai. It is finished. I have completely and fully done what I came to do. It's linked to the kind of love that Jesus showed the disciples. He loved them completely and fully. So the message to the disciples and to us is this: Jesus loves us with a full and complete love, but He's going to call us to love with that same kind of love. A love for one another, a love for the world that moves into not just a feeling of love, but acts of service and devotion. In Jesus' case, He laid down His life for the world at the cross, but He also demonstrates it to the disciples at the very beginning of this meal by washing their feet. There's an element in the Passover meal where the leader of the Passover would wash his hands before the meal. And it represented a ritual purification. His hands were going to be purified before he touched all the elements of the meal and began the teaching. In this case, Jesus, though, doesn't just wash his hands. John's Gospel tells us that He actually took off His outer garment so that He was wearing the garments of a servant, the garments of a slave. It's really ironic because in the Passover meal, the Jews would celebrate that and remember that they used to be slaves in Egypt. They used to be slaves to Pharaoh, but now they are free. Jesus is actually calling them back to a life of service, but He's calling them to intentionally become servants of God. So in this case, Pharaoh pressed the Jews into service. They had no choice. But now Jesus is calling the disciples and us to willfully choose, we are going to be servants of God's kingdom. And He demonstrates that by serving the disciples and washing their feet. Can you imagine being there? Jesus, your rabbi, your master, comes to you dressed as a slave and washes your dirty feet. The feet that had been walking through the streets of Jerusalem on that last week, and now Jesus is washing them. So in that act, He's making the statement that they have become ritually pure because of His act of sacrifice at the cross. When we receive Christ, our sin is forgiven, and we are given the righteousness of Jesus. So this is the meaning when Jesus says, you have become clean because you are in me. But He also tells the disciples, in the same way that I am serving you, I want you to serve one another. So in that, our motives are made pure by serving Jesus in the way we serve each other and the way we serve the world. Jesus demonstrates that He takes on the form of a servant, not only in washing their feet, but in humbling Himself in death. So in this case, our Messiah, our King, takes on the form of a servant. We saw that in Philippians 2 when Paul wrote about that Jesus humbled Himself, dying on a cross so that God has exalted Him. So in this Exodus remembrance, in this meal, Jesus starts it off by calling the disciples to once again think of themselves as servants, but not slaves of Pharaoh. These are slaves of the Most High God. At the cross, Jesus is going to defeat Satan in the same way that God defeated Pharaoh in the plagues and in the acts of the Exodus. So there's a lot of tying in here. Jesus becomes a new Moses, but not just a prophet, the Son of God. So now He's calling the disciples to become servants of God by choice, and even says that the apostles, the one who are sent, are no greater than their master. So He asks us to be just like Him. So in that action, you're going to read that passage in your group about how we also take the form of servants, serving one another and serving the world just as Jesus did by laying down His life. Then it turns to something very interesting. There's an element in the Passover meal in which the piece of matzah, the bread, would be dipped in a bitter herb, something like horseradish, like we did at our Passover event. And the taste of that bitter herb was meant to be a reminder of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. But Jesus gives new meaning here and says, the one who dips in the bitter herb with me is the one that will betray me. It is a reminder the bitterness that Jesus must have felt to be betrayed by a friend. And he even quotes from Psalm 41. You're going to read that in your group about how Psalm 41 talks about one who is my friend, who is sharing the table with me and is a friend in fellowship, will be the one that will betray me. Wow, how painful that must have been for Jesus to realize that one of his own disciples, Judas, was going to betray him. And in that betrayal, it names that the one who would betray Jesus is Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. So the name Iscariot doesn't seem to be his proper name, but rather a designation. The Keriot was a region in Galilee. And so Judas, Ish, the man, Ish means man, Keriot, the man from Keriot, identifies that he most likely was one of those Jewish zealots that wanted to rise up against the Romans and drive them out by force. And so we have to wonder, why did Judas betray Jesus? Perhaps the reason was that he was hoping Jesus was going to be a military king. He was going to be a ruler like David, and his hope was that Jesus was rising up against the Romans, gathering an army, taking up weapons, and saying, let's drive these Romans out. When Jesus didn't do it, perhaps Judas was getting frustrated. He wanted the kingdom of God to look the way he wanted. He wanted it to be a violent kingdom, and he wanted Israel to be put on top and Jesus to be a king, which would work out pretty good for the followers of Jesus. They would be elevated as well. When Jesus wasn't doing that, but was talking about peace, was talking about giving his life, maybe Judas was getting frustrated and said, let's see if we can step this up a bit. Perhaps if I force Jesus in to a situation where he's confronted with those who are coming to arrest him, then Jesus will have to rise up and declare himself a king. When that didn't happen, Judas was so distraught that he went out and hung himself. But here's the interesting thing. In this passage in John 13, it says when Judas went out to betray him, it was night. It's telling us that Judas is in the darkness. He doesn't understand what Jesus came to do. He's completely missing the point. But the interesting thing in that, as we think about this, is Peter is also at the table. And Jesus is going to say to Peter, you also are going to deny me 3 times. In fact, when Peter says to Jesus, I would give my life for you. And Jesus challenges and says, before the cock crows 3 times, you will deny that you even know me. What an interesting contrast, Judas and Peter. 2 of Jesus' own disciples, his own friends. One who betrays him for 30 pieces of silver, another who denies that he knows him. But afterward, think about what happens. Judas was so distraught and believed that he couldn't be forgiven, and he took his own life. Peter was distraught and thought, I'm not even willing to be called a disciple anymore. But Jesus reaches out in mercy and forgives him, calls him back into discipleship, and he becomes a pillar of the church in the book of Acts. Jesus is able to forgive Peter and use his story for the greater good and for the kingdom. So in this chapter, John chapter 13, we have this very interesting contrast. Jesus shows love to the disciples, and then he finishes with this statement that you'll read in your group. John 13:34. I'm giving you a new commandment, that you love one another. Not just with any kind of love, but the kind of love that I have shown to you. The kind of love that washes their feet. The kind of love that forgives even after a betrayal. The kind of love that sees Peter as one that can become a leader in the church, even through his failures. And then Jesus says, by this you will know, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. These are strong words, and this commandment that Jesus gives is our call for us as his followers today, to love one another, to love the world with the same kind of servanthood love that Jesus showed his disciples. All right, you're going to read about it in your group, so get going with your reading and be challenged in this measure of love that the disciples of Jesus are called to. God be with you in your group as you enter the school of discipleship with Jesus.